Does God exist? Well, in a sense, this is the most divisive of all the fundamental questions. When if you look at it historically, people have been more divided by this question than almost anything else. It has led to more conflict, more bloodshed than almost any other question. So in a sense, you could say a wise person should just stay away from it and not comment on it. But who says I'm a wise person? So the first thing I would like to comment on here is when you talk about does God exist, or which God are we talking about? Because there are so many, and historically there have been so many. So if we look at this, if we step back a little bit and look at it neutrally, we can say that human beings have a tendency to create gods, to define gods. And so the first thing we could consider is, why do we have this tendency? And I have actually explained this in my series of videos about how the world works, because I talk about how the mind has this ability to become a closed system, where we come to believe that we can define what is true and false, what is real and unreal, what is good and bad. And we do this because we go below a certain level of consciousness. We come to believe in the illusion that we are separate beings. And when we go into this state of separation, we use what I have called the duality consciousness to define what we consider to be the ultimate reality. And thereby we define that anything that goes against or contradicts or is different from that ultimate reality, this is the ultimate illusion, the ultimate lie. And this becomes what I have called the ultimate validation machine, justification machine. We can suddenly justify anything we want to justify. And this is simply a tendency, once you become aware of it, once you begin to see the dynamic of how this duality consciousness works, you can see it at play in human history. You can see how many times people have used this duality consciousness to define, here is the ultimate truth, this is the lie, and in order to defeat the lie, destroy the threat to truth, we have to kill the people who believe in the lie. You can see any number of examples. Marxism is the ultimate economic theory, it's the ultimate theory of society. Marxism is destined to take over the world, therefore it's justified that we kill those who are not communists. Christianity is the only true religion, therefore it's justified that we kill the Muslims who are opposing God's work. You can see so many examples of this, where people take this dualistic consciousness, they elevate this to the status of being some ultimate truth in this world. And the irony of this is that when people do this, they are saying, this is the ultimate truth. But in reality, their truth is relative. It's relative to them, but it's also relative to the untruth that they have defined. In other words, there's always the pair of the truth and the error, the truth and the lie, and there is no ultimate truth in this state of consciousness. The duality consciousness claims that there's an ultimate truth, but it always is a relative truth because it's relative to the people who are defining the pair for what is true and what is the lie. So if you want a typical example of this, another typical example, look at the Old Testament. Here you have a group of people in the Middle East, and this is a region that had many different tribes, and many of these tribes had their own gods. They had an individual god for each of these many tribes in the Middle East. And they were often, it was often a physical idol that they had created, some kind of statue that they worshipped, and this was their god that they worshipped. But now one of these tribes in the Middle East, one among many of these tribes, they now come up with the idea that they are not just like the other tribes. No, because they don't have just one of these tribal gods, they have the ultimate God, the superior God of the universe. And they are the chosen people of this God. And therefore, they have a right to believe that this ultimate God has told them, their little tribe, that this particular piece of land in the Middle East is the promised land, promised to them by the superior God. And therefore, it has some ultimate state of holiness. And therefore, it's fully justified that this tribe kills the people who already live on that land. You can see that in the Old Testament and Deuteronomy. And this is not to criticize any particular group of people. It's just an example of how you have one group of people who claim they have the superior God. What makes that God superior? Only their claim. Only their claim. But what is their claim based on? It's based on the duality consciousness. There's the pair. There's the one true God. All the other gods are false. And who is making the claim? This particular tribe. Does it have any objective reality beyond their own state of mind? No. It's relative to them. Therefore, it's not an ultimate truth. What does that mean? Well, look at the history of God, look at the history of religion on this planet. What have people done? They have, for centuries, even for thousands of years, they've tried to come up with arguments, right? Does God exist? Well, it's a question. And most people approach this question by coming up with arguments. Some are arguing, and there's a number of these arguments, why God must exist. There must be some ultimate being, the ultimate mover that has started everything. Then there are other people, atheists, they often call themselves, or people even from other religions, who try to come up with arguments for why a specific God does not exist, such as the Old Testament God. It was interesting to me that an atheist actually means an anti-theist. So an atheist is not necessarily a person who is against any kind of God, but it's a person who is arguing against the existence of the Old Testament God, the theist God. And so you see that for centuries these arguments and counter-arguments have been going on, right? So you can ask yourself the question, if for centuries people have been arguing for or against the existence of God, or at least for or against the existence of a particular God, how come we haven't found the ultimate argument that can settle the question? Why haven't we come up with an ultimate argument for the existence of God or against the existence of God? Well, of course, you will say, well, some people will say, but we have the ultimate argument. It's in the Bible. Or it's in scientific materialism and the theory of evolution, which has proven that there's no need for a God, for species to evolve. So, by the mere fact that you can see that people are still divided into two camps, it's obvious we haven't come up with the ultimate argument. Because the ultimate argument should convince all people, or most people. Right? If it was ultimate, you would think it would convince everybody. So, there are a couple of things we can then get out of this line of reasoning. The first we can get out of it is we can realize that when you compare to what I have talked about in my other videos about the duality consciousness, you realize that in the duality consciousness there is no ultimate argument, and there never can be. And the reason for this is that people in the duality consciousness, they take one dualistic polarity and they elevate that to being absolute. But this doesn't make it absolute. It's actually still a relative truth. And when you have a relative truth, there's no ultimate argument, because somebody else can look at the opposite dualistic polarity. For example, communism is one dualistic polarity, capitalism is another. And if you want to believe in Marxism, you can find arguments for Marxism, and you will at the same time exclude all arguments against it. Therefore, in your mind, you have proven that Marxism is the ultimate theory. If you are a capitalist, you can find arguments for capitalism. You can exclude all the arguments against it. Therefore, you can conclude in your mind that capitalism is the ultimate economic theory. And that's why there can be no ultimate argument. The same with any arguments about God. Is there a God? Is God like it's described in the Bible or in the Quran or in the Hindu scriptures or in the Buddhist scriptures or what? There's no way to settle this for people who are in the duality consciousness. So I know that most people have not ever even been taught or read anything about the duality consciousness, and it will be new to them. But nevertheless, once you look into it a little bit, you will have one of these hitting the concrete experiences where you suddenly look back at history and you say, but there is no way to settle these arguments. You can never settle a dualistic argument. It is bound to create conflict after conflict after conflict. The philosopher Hegel actually came up with a theory that any idea we formulate becomes a thesis, but it has an antithesis. And the interaction of the two opposite ideas creates a synthesis, but the synthesis then becomes the next thesis, which has another antithesis, and what he called the dialectic process goes on indefinitely. And this is true for the duality consciousness. When people are trapped in duality, there will be nothing but arguments and suffering and conflict, as we have seen for thousands of years. So is there a way beyond this? Is there a way to get out of this trap, of this dualistic struggle? Well, the first thing is, of course, to become aware of duality and the duality consciousness, and realize that it can only divide people. And by the very fact that it divides people, and that it can come up with an ultimate argument, because there's always a counter-argument, you can see that this is not the ultimate way of approaching a problem, any problem, whether it's God or any other problem. It cannot be the ultimate way. There has to be a higher way. There has to be a higher way to look at the problem. And the other thing we can do here is we can look at this and we can say, okay, let's say there is a God. Let's just for argument's sake say there is a God. If there is a God, what does the current conditions on earth tell us about this God? You have the traditional view in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, the Old Testament God, who is the almighty, all-powerful, and all-good God up there in heaven, who's sitting up there on a great white throne. He's an old man with a white beard. He's a jealous God. He's an angry God. He will send those to heaven who don't obey and worship him. So this is the traditional image of God, that God is all-powerful. But if that God existed, right? If this Old Testament God existed, and if this God really was all-powerful, why wouldn't he have wiped out all of those who are not worshiping him as the only true God? Why wouldn't he have settled once and for all the question of whether he exists by manifesting some undeniable manifestation on earth that nobody could deny? Right? So what we can observe is that God has not, if there is a God, God has not manifested an undeniable proof of its existence. So why is that? Well, I have a series of videos called How the World Works, and the first one describes how the universe was created. And it actually describes that we human beings are created as co-creators. We are not just passive beings here who are on the receiving end of what God has created. We are created to be co-creators who are finishing the creation of the world from the inside. I explained that there's a group of beings, a group of spiritual beings who created the earth, manifested the physical planet we live on, but that we were then sent here to co-create the earth and build on what these spiritual beings had created. And the reason that it works this way is that the purpose of the world is actually growth in consciousness. So we are created as individual beings. We have self-awareness and we have free will. And we are meant to descend into a physical body in a physical world, experiment with our co-creative abilities, experiment with our free will, and thereby raise our consciousness. So in a sense, the entire world is we might call it a theater, where we are part of a performance. And by taking part of that performance, we are raising our consciousness. We are expanding our sense of self. And we can continue to do this for a very long time, because there's many, many levels that we can raise our consciousness to beyond what we have on Earth. And that shouldn't be very difficult to acknowledge this when you look at the state of consciousness that many people are in on Earth and how completely self-centered they are. But what I also explain in this video is that we have kind of two basic ways we can go with our free will. We are created as beings who have a sense of connection to something outside our own minds, which is basically our higher self and the spiritual beings in a higher realm. So we can choose to use our free will in a way that expands that connection, gives us a greater and greater sense of oneness with our higher selves and with all of creation. We can also choose to go in the opposite direction. We go below a certain level of consciousness, we go into this illusion of separation. And once we go into separation, in a sense, this is an outplaying of our free will, because we have been given the right to do this. The problem is that going into separation now means we lose our connection to something outside our own minds. And that's why our minds become these self-validating closed systems. And so the question is, how can we ever get out of there? And I explain this in greater detail, the dynamic of how there is a certain state of consciousness that is meant to help us get out of this duality. But the thing is that when we are in duality, we don't necessarily want to get out of it, because we think we have reached the ultimate level of freedom, because now we can define what's right and wrong, what's true and false. And this gives us this sense of that we are like gods on earth. And many people are still trapped in this, and they still want to outlive that state of consciousness. So what I'm saying is, when you look at the earth and you look at the fact that there is no ultimate proof that God exists, you can see that there's a lot of things that kind of speak for this model that I have given, that we are co-creators. We have been given the right to go into this state of separation where we use this duality consciousness to take one relative polarity, elevate it to the status of being absolute, and we are trying to prove it, even to the point of trying to prove it by killing all people who don't agree with us. So this is a right that we have been given. And the reason for this, which I also explained in these videos, is that free will must be allowed to outplay itself. And one of the things we can do with free will is we can go into this state where we are trying to define how the universe works. When we are connected beings, we are trying to discover how the universe works, because we are trying to discover what are the principles that the spiritual beings who created our world used when they defined it. But when we go into separation, we are trying to define for ourselves how the world works. The problem is, of course, that this doesn't change how the world works. 500 years ago, many people believed the earth was flat, but the earth was as round then as it is today. So what happens in duality, we are not changing reality, but we are changing the way we look at reality. And our minds then become closed systems, which means we become subject to the school of hard knocks. So there's two ways we can learn. We can be in the school of hard knocks, where we are projecting that we are the chosen people of the superior God, and therefore we put ourselves in conflict with all other groups of people. And it's just a matter of how long do we want to keep going in this state of having conflict after conflict after conflict. That's the school of hard knocks. The alternative is that we reconnect with our own higher beings, with our spiritual teachers, and we learn through a direct inner intuitive recognition how the world actually works. So, where does this leave us in terms of God's existence? Well, it leaves us at the fact that there is no way to settle the argument. I'm not in any way trying to settle the argument. I'm not trying to come up with an ultimate argument for or against God's existence. What we can say is that human beings in duality, in this illusion of separation, they have created a number of gods. And as I explained in my videos about how the world works, we actually have quite a lot of power with our minds. I explained that we live in a world that has 4 layers, 4 levels. So there's the physical level, which is what we can detect with our senses. Then there's the emotional level, the mental level, and the identity layer. And then beyond that is a higher realm. So what drives everything in the world is energy. So there's a stream of energy that's flowing from the higher realm, first into our identity minds, where it takes on a certain form depending on how we see ourselves. Then it flows into the mental realm, where we make the images more concrete, more accurate, and then it flows into the emotional, and then finally into the physical. So this is how we co-create. We co-create by taking the energy we receive from our higher selves and imposing these mental images upon it until it manifests as something physical. I explain in these videos that the struggle, the poverty, the lack of resources that we currently believe is real is a temporary condition that we have created collectively. And I explain why and how we've created it, so I won't go into it here. But what I'm saying here is that we can take this process and we can apply it to the status, or to the question of, does God exist? And we can say, what does it mean to exist? Well, ultimately we would say there are certain things that were not created by human beings. So we could say, as science has said, there are certain natural laws. And they were not created by human beings. The law of gravity was not created by human beings, therefore it exists. So I would say that there are certain things that we human beings here on earth have not co-created. Poverty, lack of resources, we have co-created, but it's a temporary condition, because when we stop co-creating it, we will go back to a natural state where there's plenty of resources. So there are things that are temporary, but they are not ultimately real. They don't ultimately exist because they are co-created by us humans, and they are not in alignment with how the world actually works, how the universe actually works. So we can say that there are certain gods that we human beings have over time created. And how does that work? Well, you take the Old Testament God, for example. Since I'm in the process of insulting religious people, I might as well insult the biggest faction on earth. So we have the Old Testament God. It's claimed that this is the ultimate God, the superior God. But it's actually a man-made God. A God that human beings have created over time. And how have they done it? In your identity mind, you identify yourself as a certain kind of person. You might be God's chosen people. You might be the Christians who are the only true followers of this superior God, or the Muslims who are the only true followers of this superior God. And you have that sense of identity. So you take energy, you qualify it with your mental images. Then in the mental realm, you have an even more concrete mental image of what this God is like. And as you are putting your attention on this, as you are worshipping this God, you are again feeding energy into that image, into that matrix. Then in your emotional body, you have a certain emotions about this God. It might be reverence, it might be respect, but for most people, especially with the Old Testament God, it's fear. People are afraid of this God. They're afraid of going against it. They're afraid of questioning it. Many people would, if they ever watched this video, they would respond with fear. And they would think that I'm of the devil and I'm destined to be punished and go to hell by this superior God. So you have a lot of fear. And what has happened is that over thousands of years, look, over 3 billion people on the planet worship the Old Testament God. And over a long period of time, they have fed energy into this matrix in the emotional, mental, and identity bodies. And what have they done? They have, as I explained in my other series of videos, they have created this entity that has the characteristics of the Old Testament God. An angry being in a higher realm that wants people to worship it. Why does this God want people to worship it? Because it's the only way it can survive. It needs energy. Now you ask yourself, the superior God of the universe, right? Why would the superior God of the universe need to be worshipped by human beings on planet Earth, which when you look at the universe, it's just a speck of dust? Why would the superior God have any need to get energy from people on Earth? If God has created the entire universe, God must have unlimited energy. So why would that God need energy from human beings on Earth? The only being, the only God that needs energy from human beings is a God created by human beings, because it was created out of people giving it their energy, and it can only continue to survive by people continuing to give it energy. This is the logical explanation for why we have created all of these gods and why they are projecting at us, projecting into people's minds that we need to continue to worship them and pray to them and give them this energy, and you need to go to church every Sunday and put your attention on this God. It's simply because this God needs energy. It needs to be fed by the people who created it. So, am I thereby saying that the Old Testament God exists? Yes, the Old Testament God exists in the emotional, mental, and identity realms of planet Earth. It is created by human beings. It is upheld by the human beings who worship it and fear it and thereby give it energy. It has reached a certain status where it's able to project fear into people's emotional bodies, certain thoughts into their mental bodies, and even a certain sense of identity into their identity bodies, where some people believe that they are the chosen people of this superior God. They are the only true followers. They belong to the only true church. And this gives them a sense of status in their identity bodies. They feel better than other people. And so this has become this unholy alliance where people have created the God, but the God now has become strong enough that it can project into people's minds, take over people's minds, and it gives them a sense of superiority. They are special because they believe in this God. So it's an unholy alliance. You know, you scratch my back, I scratch your back, and this is how this God was created. This is how it's upheld. But of course, this is not the only God that's that way. Human beings have created many other gods. Now, you can see that some of these gods have faded away because people started doubting their existence, they stopped believing in it, and therefore they stopped feeding their energy. You can see, for example, the Nordic gods, Odin and Thor, they were never really that powerful to begin with. There were only a limited number of people believing in them. But today, not very many people believe in them. So you see that gods can be created and gods can fade away because it's all a matter of how much energy people feed into them. And of course, you know, probably the Old Testament God is still the most powerful God on the planet, but it is a temporary God. And why do I say this? Because what does it do? It only creates conflict. It creates division. But what I explain in my series about how the world works is that when you go beyond this duality consciousness, where you see everything in terms of separation, you start to intuitively sense first a connection, then a greater sense of oneness. And what happens is that when people start connecting to their higher selves personally, at a personal level, you also start connecting to the underlying oneness behind all life. I actually explain in some of these videos that there is a consciousness that is based on oneness. I call it the consciousness of Christ. You can also call it the Buddha nature or other names. But when we were given free will, there was created this consciousness that can always help us get back out of separation and duality, because it is based on oneness. So for every illusion we create that makes it seem like we are separate beings, this consciousness has a higher understanding that's based on oneness. So we can get out of separation. So when we start expanding our connection to our higher selves, we stop seeing ourselves as separated from other people. We start seeing a greater oneness. This is what Jesus talked about. This is what even Muhammad talked about. The Buddha talked about. Beyond all of the outer conflicts, there is a oneness. There is one substance. And when you go up to a higher and higher connection with your higher selves, you also begin to overcome the separation, the idea that we are separated from the spiritual realm. If you look at the Old Testament God, we are separated. In the whole mindset of the Old Testament God, we are separated from that God. Because God is up there in heaven and we are down here and we are sinners and whatnot. So there's this clear image of separation. But when you start overcoming this, when you start locking into this unifying consciousness that's behind everything, you realize we are not separated from the spiritual realm. But the first connection you make is not with the ultimate God, it's with the spiritual beings that exist in a higher realm that's right above earth. And then, as I explained, there are several levels that lead up to higher and higher levels until you reach the ultimate level of awareness, which is what we could call God or the Creator. So you go from levels of differentiation towards more and more oneness, and you eventually reach the level where there's only one God, there's only one being, there's only one mind. Everything is an expression of that mind. Everything came out of that mind. So this is the ultimate God. But this is not a God that was created by human beings, because it has no form. You can experience the ultimate God, which many mystics throughout the ages have experienced. Many mystics throughout the ages have had this experience of a formless being. You cannot describe it. You cannot put words on it. You cannot put images on it. Because there is nothing in the world of form that can describe the Creator, because the Creator, the Source, the one being, is beyond form. It's the originator of form, but it's beyond form. It has no form. And that's why you can look at any God that has form, and it's not the ultimate God. You can take Genesis, where there's a statement that says that God supposedly said, "Let us make man in our own likeness and after our own image." But if God has a likeness and an image, it's not the ultimate God. And what has actually happened is that we human beings, when we go into the duality consciousness, we start creating gods after our own image and likeness, because we are projecting our qualities onto God as a way to ultimately validate what our egos want to do and want to act out. That is the whole purpose for this possibility that we can go into duality. It says in Genesis, talks about the forbidden fruit, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and the serpent said, "Ye become as gods, knowing good and evil." But you don't become as gods knowing good and evil, you become as gods defining good and evil. And that's what happens when you go into duality consciousness. And in the duality consciousness, you use your own image and likeness to create a God and project that God has these images, and that's why it's ultimately justified that you act out what your ego wants to act out. And it's just, as I explained, it's perfectly allowed within the law of free will that people do this. So I'm not trying to say here with this video that this is wrong what people are doing, but I am saying it has a consequence. And you will, as long as you believe in this kind of a God, you'll be trapped in duality. You'll be trapped in suffering. You'll be trapped, and there will be people who oppose your God. And the whole scenario of conflict and suffering that we have seen going on for thousands of years, you will just repeat it endlessly until you come to a point where you have had enough of it. And so this is really my only purpose for doing this video, because I know I have experienced it in myself and I've met thousands of people. There are more and more people in today's age who have had enough of this. They've had enough of this conflict about God, this conflict about religion, and they are looking for something higher. There's got to be something else. There's got to be a better approach to religion, to the existence of God. And this talk has only one purpose. If this is what you sense intuitively, well, there is a way out of this religious struggle. And I've given a number of videos where I talk about this, where I talk about the duality consciousness. And it really starts there. It really starts by realizing that in duality, you think you can prove anything, but you're not really proving anything. You're just proving that by excluding all contrary evidence, you have seemingly proven the point, but the point is just a relative point. So what is happening in this time we're living in is that more and more people have come to this point where they've had enough of this, had enough of the struggle. They are going into what Abraham Maslow, as I mentioned in the previous videos, talk about self-actualization. And self-actualization means that basically you transcend the need to believe in an exterior God. And you start looking for God inside yourself. You start looking for some higher experience, some higher awareness, some higher reality inside yourself, instead of looking up there to the angry being in the sky. You can no longer believe in these external gods that have been defined and that have form, because you start to sense there must be something inside of you that can't be defined by any external form or any external scripture. That is when you can begin to tackle the question of God's existence in an entirely different way. Because now it's not a matter of believing what somebody says, it's not a matter of arguing for or against, it's a matter of experiencing. And the first thing you will begin to experience is a sense of connection to a higher part of your own being, your own mind. There's something you experience, there's something beyond the outer mind that always argues. And when you achieve a more and more clear experience of that, you see that there is a mind that unifies everything, that unifies human beings. And it does this by pointing you beyond all of the definitions we have on earth, because the definitions can only divide us. You are Muslim, you are Christian, you are Hindu, you are Buddhist, you are an atheist. They're all dividing us. But mysticism, the direct experience of something higher, takes you away from this division. It takes you beyond the division. And you see that there's a unifying element. And you can then gradually expand that sense of unity, that unification, until you can come to a point where you can experience the ultimate creator, the source. But you will experience it as a being that has no form that can be described in words or images here on earth. And then it's like the question, does God exist? It's not that it has been answered with a yes or no. It's just become obsolete. It just disappears. It just vanishes. Is there only darkness, or is there light? It's a question you could ask if you grew up in a dark cave in a mine deep underground and you had never seen the sun. But the moment you walk to the surface of the earth and you experience the sunrise, what happens to the question, is there only darkness, or does the light exist? It just disappears, right? And that's what happens when you start to experience oneness. It's not a matter of arguing. It's not a matter of finding the ultimate argument. You either experience it or you don't experience it. And I'm not saying that you should believe what I'm saying. I'm not trying to come up with an argument here. I'm just trying to point and say, for thousands of years, people have had the direct experience of oneness beyond diversity, oneness beyond conflict. And you can have that experience too. There's a systematic path for having it, which I describe in some of my breakthrough videos. But there are many other ways to describe it, many other forms of mysticism. So if you really want to settle the question, does God exist? Then there is a way to do so. It will be an individual way for you depending on where you started out, what your background is, but it is possible to transcend the question. The ultimate way to deal with a question is not actually to answer it the way it was asked, because the question is always asked from a certain level of consciousness. So if you ask the question, does God exist? It can only be asked from a level of consciousness where you have not had the direct experience. And that's what I'm saying. This is the duality consciousness, the illusion of separation. You can only ask the question, does God exist, when you are trapped in the illusion of separation. But when you transcend that level of consciousness, it's not that you are answering the question yes or no, because you are realizing that in the duality consciousness, in separation, you cannot really fathom what God is. So you're always asking a specific question, does this God exist? But the God that has form has no ultimate existence. So therefore, when you transcend that level of separation and you start to experience oneness, you're not answering the question, does the separate God exist, yes or no? You are transcending the question, where the question becomes obsolete. And that is the ultimate answer to any question. The transcendence of consciousness. You are transcending the level of consciousness from which the question was asked. And that is how you truly resolve any question. Any of the fundamental questions of life. You can say, what is the real purpose of these fundamental questions of life? It's to provide us with an enigma, a challenge, something that there comes a point where we can't ignore the question. We have to think about it. But the purpose is not to answer the question the way we originally formulated. The purpose is to help us transcend the level of consciousness so that the question becomes obsolete, because now we see a higher reality.